Afternoon. Welcome to the second Sash conversation with spiritual leaders. The first was on June 18th. 7 leaders joined in a lively and engaging dialogue on how to guide and support leaders, spiritual leaders, when members approach them about issues of sexual health and addiction. We have been told that often people will approach spiritual leaders because of feeling more comfortable and financial considerations initially. Supporting and equipping spiritual leaders does help. So I'd like to just invite everyone to say who he or she is, because we've 1 or 2 people that unfortunately we just didn't get a chance to get your bio. So I'll ask each person to begin. So Gina, would you be okay with starting?
Hi, yes, I'll introduce myself. I'm an educator and advocate here in Austin, Texas, and I'm also a partner coach working closely with Michelle Mays at Partner Hope. And Michelle is a CSAT therapist. I'm also a former pastor's wife, which is why I'm a good fit for this discussion.
Jim, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I am Jim Prager. I am from Toledo, Ohio, a very proud member of Sash and just delighted to be here. I am a prison survivor. I've been out 21 years and have become an advocate for social justice for those people who are incarcerated and their families, and particularly people with sexual convictions.
Thank you, Jim. Michelle, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Michelle Neverdon. I'm a licensed professional counselor at Riverside Counseling. I work off and on with Brian. I also specialize and am certified in trauma therapy. I am a leader at my church. I do counseling there. I provide lay counseling at New City Fellowship in Fredericksburg. And this is my first time. Brian invited me, so I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Michelle. Ray, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Raymond Bell. I'm a local pastor in the Fredericksburg, Virginia area. Also an addictions coach. Love working with men as they deal with addiction issues as it relates to sexuality, and glad to be with you.
Thank you, Ray. Michael, please.
Sure. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Mike Supressi. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, certified employee assistance professional, also a sex addiction therapist as well. I'm a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. I just was ordained in 2019.
Thank you. Roy, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roy Kim. I am a former pastor and now a CSAT in Southern California. I like working with men with sexual addictions. I like working with their betrayed partners. I like working in both capacities, particularly in group format. And I also love working with pastors with sexual addiction.
Thanks, Roy. Jeff, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Bischoff. I was ordained a Lutheran pastor about 32 years ago and got into social work about 17, 18 years ago. I have pastored congregations and I've worked in juvenile residential settings and excuse me, mental health outpatient settings for 14 years of my counseling career. I specialized in working with people with sexual behavior problems, including people who had been convicted of sexual offenses. Also worked with sexual abuse victims for 7 years. Currently, I'm located both in Northwest Ohio and in the Detroit metro area. I pastor a congregation in Northwest Ohio, and I am in residence at a Lutheran monastery in the Detroit metro area, where I provide pastoral care and worship leadership. I'm also continuing my work as a licensed professional counselor. using online therapy right now. It's my first experience with online. I've been in person for 30 years, so it's interesting to be online. And I take that back. I've been in counseling not 16 or 18 years, more like it's 26 years. I missed 10 years out of that.
Jeff, thank you. I'm Brian Vaughn. I'm a licensed professional counselor, also a CSAT and a certified sex offender treatment provider here at Riverside Counseling with Michelle also. At one time, I was a Roman Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of Washington for 14 years from the early 80s through the mid 90s. Went back to school in the 2000s, obtained my mental health counseling degree, and then eventually got to work as a CSAT. I've been at this particular practice for the last 3 years. So I'm really grateful to Sash to have this opportunity again to lead this conversation on how to best support spiritual leaders as they can best support their members of their faith communities regarding issues of sexual health and sexual addiction. So we have a number of questions. Mary sent them out to all of you. So as we did last time, I'm just going to say what the question is and then invite anyone who'd like to say something about that. And then we'll continue the conversation from there. We will go until 3 o'clock Eastern time. So again, let's continue to talk with each other about these very, very important issues. So number one is boundaries. What does it mean to set boundaries? So sub question A, appropriate touch, empathetic hug. Secondly, conversations, delicate, sensitive subjects, asking or location of conversations. Lastly, working with youth. So let's just talk a little bit about what does it mean to set boundaries first, and then we'll go through each one of those.
I would say that there are different types of boundaries. There are physical boundaries, there are emotional boundaries, and there are cognitive boundaries. And I'd say the practice of setting boundaries is done in the interest of keeping everyone clear about what is going on in any kind of interaction, and also to keep people safe and to provide for a sense of safety. So you might set a cognitive boundary and say, for this time, we're going to talk about this, but we're not going to talk about this. You might set a physical boundary and say, well, you know, in the setting, we are going to use this space for this purpose and not use this space for that purpose. That would be setting a boundary. Physical boundaries can also be set between people, and those boundaries might vary depending on the relationship that the people have with each other, and also in cultural. The different cultures have different physical boundaries. There are emotional boundaries where, you know, I'm going to say that my emotions are my emotions and your emotions are your emotions, and I'm not going to take over your emotions, and I'm going to set limits so that I let you know when you're taking over my emotions, because this is mine and that's yours, and keeping all those things defined. Just a few examples of what I see as those three main types of boundaries.
Thank you, Jeff.
I think it's interesting how COVID has really shifted some of these physical boundaries in particular. You know, as someone who tends to be a hugger, it's very constraining in some ways. So just dealing with all the stress of our times when physical touch can be reassuring and comforting, it creates a distance in some ways. So, and I see that where I worship, our rabbi, we do fist bumps.
I'd like to add one more boundary that I guess is maybe kind of COVID related, political boundaries. I think certain topics aren't addressed or discussed anymore. Just maybe because there's a difference of opinion, or as Jeff had said, just kind of the emotional aspect of certain political discussions. So that's another boundary. Yeah.
I think that, and especially in my particular context, hugging and touching is very significant in our congregation. That's seen as some form of Christian intimacy. And so in my particular context, many of my disciples or many members of my congregation said they joined because they felt the church was very friendly, that we were very touchy, we were very feel, we were very huggy. However, we've had to set some boundaries. We've had to create some type of teaching of what it means to have a Christian hug versus grabbing someone and holding them tightly. And so I think that's a subject that's always under discussion, because like some men might even feel comfortable with certain women hugging them, and some women might feel comfortable with certain men hugging them the wrong way. So we've really had to kind of outline, this is what we would see as more of a Christian intimate hug, space between the bodies, maybe more touching of the shoulders, a light touch, or like you said, a fist pump, or, just kind of say, hey. But the hugging aspect was brought to our attention, and so we tried to manage that.
I would like to add that I think a reason why boundaries is an important topic of conversation as we engage faith leaders is just because in faith cultures and the church at large, there's just way too many scandals erupting. And we see it in the news, and there seems to be an inappropriateness, but really what I see in that is it's a misuse of power. And because we know people turn to faith leaders for help, that they're trusted entities and that they're in a position where people defer to them, I think that's at the heart of some of this, is just really holding faith leaders accountable and encouraging them from the point of hire, through their staff and team, to have accountability, to talk, to preempt these discussions, as a way of reducing the issues that come up so that we can be appropriate. Yeah.
I'll add something as well. I think that in many churches, there is an assumption that pastors and elders and deacons are beyond reproach, that they, of course, these people who are servants of God do not struggle with sexual brokenness. And some people in those positions, whether it's on purpose or not, they would actually take advantage of that assumption. And so the ones who actually do struggle with sexual brokenness, and they are in these counseling situations where they are one-to-one, it's late at night, the doors are closed, they would just kind of, I don't know, I guess they would not focus or not address the fact that they have this propensity, and they would go ahead and one thing leads to another, and one boundary gets crossed after another. And that's where the scandals start to form that Gina was mentioning. And so I feel like if more Christians were to assume that all people in the church, leadership or not, have inherited the original sin that manifests itself in brokenness in all areas of life, including sexuality, then I think that would really create the motivation for boundaries to be formed for all people, whether we consider them to be more prone to these things or not, but just kind of more like a universal rule, I think that would be good to have for safeguarding the church in these kinds of situations.
Before moving on to the A of the question, appropriate touch, Michelle, just wondering if you have any initial thoughts? Michelle,
you're muted.
Sorry, people typically come to me in my church with the problems that you all have discussed. There was some inappropriate touching a couple of years ago before COVID even hit. And I find sometimes the leadership is reluctant to attack the problem, more kind of soft shoe it. And so that's a concern that I have, that I've seen in the church. These types of things need to be brought out and talked about. I don't think people need to be singled out, but I think leadership needs to talk about it seriously and come up with a way of handling it so that people don't feel some kind of way about it or feel like they can approach leadership with it. And so in that particular instance, I met with some of the other leaders and we talked about how to approach the problem and deal with the problem. And I think that that's the way these things should be handled. And people shouldn't, once we actually opened this problem up, we found out there were a lot more people that had been affected by it, but didn't want to come forward with it. So I think it needs to be part of a conversation. And I still believe that people are reluctant to walk up to leadership or approach leadership with things that are going on in the church for fear of repercussion or just the fears that people have in church organizations of being singled out.
Thank you, Michelle. So focusing on a specific point, appropriate touch, do leaders talk about that in a given setting? Maybe not necessarily during a service on Sunday, but is there more conversation, training, education about that? Obviously modeling. Just wondering what any of you all think.
I like what Raymond said about recognizing an issue with appropriate touch in his congregation and then addressing it head on and setting those limits and saying, this is okay, this is not okay. I think we operate under the assumption that people know what is okay and what isn't okay, but not everybody knows that. And as was said, there are some who would take advantage of boundaries, testing them out, seeing, they were targeting a certain person to say, this is what this person will let me get away with. I'm going to go a little bit further. I think it's important for congregational leaders, faith leaders to be aware of that and to be comfortable addressing it, especially for their own for their own selves. And also, if they see this going on between people, the inappropriate touch, some suspicious activity, to be comfortable and to be competent in challenging that in a productive way and saying, it doesn't look like things are going right here, and there may be something that needs to happen, some kind of intervention.
Follow up on that, Jeff. I think it's very important. And I forgot to mention that, as leader, I'm a hugger. As a leader, I'm a toucher. And so I had to then, Gina and Michelle, watch my behavior. I also examine my motives. Sometimes people are just close to you, but at the same time, let me watch my behavior because my men are looking at me. And of course, people love to hug the pastor, but then I have to start setting the example of what appropriate hugging was. And so that was I won't say a challenge, but maybe it will, because I had to change my persona. I had to change how I address people, because I'll come in, hey, what's going on? And grab a hug and kiss someone on the cheek. Now I have to restructure or reframe my style of what it means to be a greeting and personable pastor. So it started with me. I couldn't just speak it from the pulpit. I had to go ahead also and start kind of living it out.
It's also possible, Raymond, right, that someone could misinterpret even what you define as a healthy hug. So I guess I'm thinking too, in the faith communities, how we talk about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. I mean, we could rule this to death and try to figure out an exact formula to keep everyone safe, but it doesn't work like that. It's really the spirit of transparency and living in the light, not in darkness. Like at the core of this, it is about not going into the shadows and not being pulled into the darkness in your heart and the way you operate. And if everyone's living in the light, and so I guess even just that communication of that expectation in our communities from the staff on down, that we live lives of transparency and authenticity and integrity.
I guess an eye opener for me was I work a lot with the domestic violence clinic, and I would talk to women there, and some of them would tell me, as well as my clients, how deathly afraid they are of being touched, but they don't want to tell anybody because they don't want to feel weird or make other people feel weird. So it kind of put me in a place where I'm a hugger too. I started asking people, or I would gesture to them, is it okay if I hug you? Or sometimes I just pick up on people's spirits. It's not okay. And I think some of these, like we're all saying, some of this needs to come across in leadership in the pulpit, that these are okay things to do. It's okay to say, it's not okay for you to give me a hug. There was a woman I talked to who, just in talking about being touched, she just broke down and she lost it. And I thought about that woman in a church setting or just in society, how difficult it must be for her to just make her way. So that just stays in my mind and my thoughts.
Well, that's a time to focus then on the next part of this question, as far as when, where, and how with these delicate or potentially very private conversations. As Michelle said a moment ago about asking permission, also the location where something may occur. What might be the best circumstances when there is a one-on-one conversation, or what, in other words, what's the location? And when we were putting this together, Mary mentioned something about the PLISSIT model. Would you like to talk a little bit about that right now, Mary?
I can. The PLISSIT model is something that they use a lot in like medical communities, where you're first asking permission to approach a certain topic, or go even with what Michelle was saying, like, may I give you a hug? Can I come hold your hand? Whatever it is. But first you ask permission to talk about sensitive subjects. And then at each stage, figuring out where you are professionally, because the next stage is, can you give specific suggestions to help them, but also knowing where your expertise begins and ends, right? And letting them know, like, I'm part of this community. I don't really know, there could be more in X community, and then intensive therapy. And, that would be probably where a lot of pastoral folks or spiritual leaders would have to say, this sounds like it needs a little bit more intense work. Can I make some recommendations? Can we work together? So the PLISSIT model is just a way of framing it up for professionals of where you begin and end and how to approach clients.
Thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add something before we move to the second topic? I hope we don't negate the importance of touch. I'm thinking of, I'm actually thinking of people who are ill, people who are, we anoint, people who, where it's very important to them. It's healing. And I think it falls in line with what we're talking about. It's the intent. I think what Gina said is just kind of like, what is it we're bringing to light? And I think Michelle said, what is the person needing, but there are times, I know particularly with we have a practice of anointing the sick, which is a physical thing that you do. I don't think it's misconstrued. It's not a hug or it's not effusive, but it's very significant and very meaningful for people.
I think sometimes also we, as professionals and advocates, also set an example of what is appropriate in turn. And I'm focusing really on what Gina said about transparency. We have a new rabbi, and I was telling him part of my story of being a sexual abuser, and he started to go and close the door to his office. And I told him, it's not necessary. You know, I can be out in the open and it's okay. So then he sat down and he relaxed. So it was just an example where I had to set a boundary or an expectation for him.
I'll just say one thing as well about the complexity, I think, of asking permission. I think that like when Michelle was mentioning earlier about some people who may have some experiences of domestic violence, and when someone asks them permission, they shrink back. That is a clear indication of someone's awareness of their feelings of unsafety in a situation like that. There are other situations, whether it be with youth or with just really any person, if I think about it, who, if they're in a company of a pastor and there immediately is a sense of a power dynamic, a power imbalance between the two of them. And if the pastor were to say, do I have permission to, hold your hand or put my hand on your knee or put my hand on your shoulder? That person may just instinctively say, sure, that's fine, only because this is the pastor. Like, I don't want to say no to the pastor. Yeah. But what if that pastor does have these patterns? They put their hand on the other person's hand, but then they start stroking it, right? Or they start stroking the shoulder or stroking the knee. And it's just, whether it's same-sex attraction, whether it's heterosexual, whatever it is, but they're just doing these things for their own pleasure. And here this person said yes because of the power imbalance. And then later on, if the pastor is questioned, the pastor then says, well, the person said yes. I asked permission and the person said yes. And so it's like, oh no, like, what do we do with this really complex situation? And so I know I'm muddying the waters here a little bit, but I feel like it's better to kind of bring all these into the light so that we can talk about, like, what do we actually do in these complex situations?
Roy, I appreciate that, because that really is, like, as I see it, at the core often of these situations with spiritual leaders. And going back to something that Raymond said a bit ago, often the spiritual leader is seen as someone who can't make mistakes, is highly esteemed, if not, quote, in small caps, godly. And so he or she knows everything. So going back to Mary's model of Blitz, it talks about the pastor, or again, the spiritual leader, saying, well, this is as far as I know, and then I'm going to recommend you go here. Because again, people will still approach a spiritual leader as if he or she will know everything about everything. And if a spiritual leader is not aware of that, in my understanding, that would be a potential, if not for sure, form of abuse with someone. So the last part of this is any discussion regarding how this is played out as far as boundaries with youth.
I would say an important boundary for pastors with youth is to avoid being one-on-one unless it's absolutely necessary. I know there are situations where a youth might come to a pastor and want some pastoral counseling, and they just have to be very careful about that. Because things can be misconstrued. A person with good intentions could be caught up in misinterpreted actions, misinterpreted behaviors, but also there's that other side where you have the person with evil intentions who takes advantage. So I think it's important for a congregation to have general expectations for their, not only their paid staff, but also their volunteer staff for working with youth. And when there are extraordinary situations where a pastor or a volunteer might need to be one-on-one with a youth, that there's a team aspect among the ministers to say, hey, you know, one so-and-so asked me to meet with them one-on-one. Could you be in the building? Could you, so that there's awareness around. And I think it was Gina said something about being in the shadow areas, and that's, I think of, you want to stay out of the shadows. You want to stay in the light. You want to keep things appropriately known, and not get into those dark corners, because that's where all the trouble starts.
And leadership teams need to have that wisdom, and like we said, not expecting that people of faith are superhumans, but have the wisdom that there needs to be structure and protocols and expectations for all staff through volunteers. And I think that can really save a lot of heartache.
To piggyback on that, I think that there should be a level of transparency, not just written, but verbally to everybody involved, so that it's, you know, maybe it seems like you're beating into the ground, but everybody is clear and aware of what the position of leadership is with respect to youth and adults, meeting youth and adults. And you just keep driving that home to people, let them know it shouldn't be something that's hidden. It should be out there in both written and verbal form.
Well, and to add to that, I think the onboarding process for any volunteer or staff member is a prime opportunity just to get practical. But like if it is in writing, and then you're going, whenever you're bringing someone on, there's trainings usually, no matter your position, but going over the written documents, backing it up by verbal, and reiterating things like, you know, we are all human and we have limitations, and no one person in this church or facility is the end all be all of being able to help people. And have, you know, just clear expectations of, we refer out when it exceeds our limitations. You know, we ask for help. And even having I know, like, having been a former pastor's wife, there were struggles going on with my husband, and he was the senior pastor. And where do you go when you're the helping professionals and you need help? And if every church had an entity outside their church, you know, where it was like, that was even part of what the structure was in advance, is here's a number to call, you know, someone, a behavioral health specialist or another trusted faith mentor that you can confide in. Because how many times do we set people up where they're given responsibilities and they're the leaders and nobody's looking out for their needs and helping them know where to go when they need help?
Yeah. Two things. One, I guess this theme of respect, I was thinking as everyone was talking, is the respect for vulnerability, which is hugely important. And I think that should be part of the training. It really, that's hugely important. And it should be part of the ethos of people. And then, Gina, what the thought that crossed my mind is my background. I have a background in employee assistance, and you know, church is a workplace. I know it's a spiritual workplace, a different type of workplace, but you know, there are ways of contracting with professionals, and you know, it's been done. Actually, right before I got here, I got a call from Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. They make a lot of referrals to me, and it's kind of like an employee assistance type program for attorneys. So there's that it's available, and it's certainly congregations should consider it. And what's the benefit of an employee assistance program? It takes you, it's a neutral party. It's outside of the church itself, and all those power things that people get caught up in. It doesn't really happen, like in an employee assistance situation. Someone's coming, and they have an issue, and we simply help them with it. So it's another thought.
That touches on another question we'll look at later on, but I want to shift this because since we're talking about youth right now, question number 5, mandated reporting and abuse situations. So how do we see our role as spiritual leaders in child abuse? First of all, maybe not everyone is a mandated reporter. I know, obviously, I am. The rest of us who are therapists or psychologists are, but just curious about that, and how do we deal with that situation?
Well, as far as I know, the rules for mandated reporting vary from state to state. But I know in the state of Ohio, if you are working for a religious organization, you are a mandated reporter. So if you are aware that there is a child who is at risk of abuse or neglect, you are legally obligated to report that. And that's the law. And if there's something going on and a person doesn't report it, and for whatever reason chooses not to, and it could very well be religious grounds for not reporting that. However, if
You're saying, Mike, in Pennsylvania, obviously.
Sometimes it disturbs me the way those of us who are people who have sexually abused are almost coached to not give enough information that I have to report it. And it just feels very murky to me at times. That we can say up to a certain level that don't give identifying information, so I know it's Jenny Smith, let's say. And I think we do a disservice to both the offender and the potential victim in doing that.
hopefully what's happening there, because if I'm working with a person who is beginning to disclose something that I may have to report, well, the first thing is in the initial conversations of a helping relationship, needs to be made clear that I am a mandated reporter. And so that boundary, if you will, is set, and there's an expectation there where I share with the client or the person I'm working with that if this is starting to sound like something that I may have to report, I'm going to let you know. And that is an ethical obligation that I have to the client. However, that and if they start telling me something, and then I have an ethical obligation once again to the client to say, you may be telling me things that I'm going to have to report. And then it's up to that person whether to go on or not. But Jim, for a professional to coach someone like you're describing, I think is unethical to say, well, let's talk about it, but don't tell me so much that I have to report it. I would say that professional is shirking their responsibility, like you say, to the client and also to the victim who's out there. All that, once again, boundaries, conversations about boundaries, those things needing to be very clear and upfront, so that things are, I like that image of things being in the light and in the shadows, and we want to bring these things out into the light so that they can be dealt with, and so that healing can happen for all involved. So Yeah, Jim, I'm aware that happens, but it should not be happening. That's not good practice.
So I have a question. It's part of clinicians' informed consent that we tell folks, if you become an imminent danger to yourself or others, if you tell me about abuse of a minor, even past abuse, we have them sign off on that. How does that work in faith communities when a 16-year-old, a 12-year-old comes to your office and says, I need to talk, how do you guys work with that, and how can we help spiritual leaders work with that? Or even when an adult comes, what's the informed consent process look like?
Well, I think in general, I know I went to seminary 35 years ago. And although we talked about boundaries, we talked about reporting, we did not talk about informed consent as far as pastoral counseling relationships. And I'm not involved in seminaries, so I'm not sure what's going on now in the training of faith leaders, but I would say that would be a very important part of professional development, that pastoral counseling, although it's usually an informal thing, it would benefit from becoming more formalized. Now, I say that because my pastoral work is informed by my professional counseling work and vice versa. But getting some continuing education, making sure that's a part of professional development, those kinds of things, making sure that the door has been opened and the conversation has been started so that people are thinking about these things and aware of these kinds of things so that they don't wind up in sticky situations where they get in trouble and worse, people get hurt.
I think in many situations, the church is not prepared or has not been prepared for sexual scandals or just for individuals, male or female, who might have issues in their lives that need to be addressed in a Christian way. If someone is on drugs or someone's on alcohol and it's very excessive and out of control, the church has been able to find ways of addressing that through therapy, through NA, through AA. But it's something about the sexual brokenness that oftentimes in church settings we tend to hide and kind of scoot around. I think in our setting now we've come to realize that any accusation, any comment, not just with clergy, with anybody, if a man is being too aggressive with another man in a sexual way, or a woman in a sexual way, it doesn't have to be heterosexual. It's worthy of some form of investigation, of some form of, we have to look into this to see if this is a valid. We have a team in place that will look into it and see if it's valid, to gather some data within a certain period of time. And then we have to make a decision whether it's something that can be handled in-house or the authorities have to be called in.
Would add to what Raymond's saying, just that the need for education among seminary students on up through leaders is just huge, because I don't even know that there's like addiction 101, trauma 101, abuse 101. I mean, there's so many foundational or so much foundational information that could really help all of these issues we're talking about. And knowledge is power. It is. And I think it begins there. And so maybe that's, those of us wanting to make an initiative and an effort in this area, that's something to consider, is how do we bring more education on these issues and open it up, and then give more practical, concrete solutions to these problems.
I think that's absolutely correct, because I know when I was in seminary, and I came out of seminary 87, 86, something like that. I mean, there was nothing discussed of this matter. And I think I went to a pretty good seminary, but nothing discussed of this matter. I don't even believe the seminary professors had a clue. And I think back in those days, definitely, Roy, things were just hid under the carpet. Probably so many people were abused, but never came forward with it, So now, I don't know what's going on in the seminaries now, but I would recommend it. Yes, it should be part of some type of curriculum training, that before they complete their 3 years of seminary training, somehow they become abreast of the stats and statistics and the brokenness that takes place with leaders and with parishioners, period. I mean, I keep emphasizing that, not just with leaders, but you have, people who are married in the church who wind up getting maybe involved with another married person in church. And then this swings to another thing. I mean, it leads to something else. And so I think, of course, I know what our topic of discussion is today, but I think it's a broader picture that we still have to address.
Interesting. One of the things that that I've seen, which is really, I'm really delighted by, is like my church called me about a year ago to do almost 3 months of mental health Sunday school classes. And I did trauma, depression, anxiety. I did sexual abuse. And another church in the PECA contacted me about coming to their leaders and talking to them about mental health issues. And that makes me hopeful, because you have to have that conversation with mental health leaders. I mean, they're who the people come to. And if they don't feel equipped to handle it, then there's a problem. So I think however that happens, it should be part of a regular learning format for leaders in churches to have somebody come in, preferably somebody in the mental health field, and have these kind of conversations where questions can be asked, trauma, all these mental health issues can be discussed, behavioral issues can be discussed, and people start getting a better understanding. When people come to them, leaders, when they come to them and ask for help, then they don't feel so like they can't, like they don't have a clue.
I think a common
Yeah.
theme that's just jumping out here is that someone, the faith leader, he or she feels equipped enough to not freeze at the bottom line and respond. So someone else is getting ready to say something, so please do so.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in the Catholic Church, there is a, and I've just kind of pulled it up, and it's a 30-page document, so I couldn't really read it while we're talking here. But there is a charter for the protection of children and young people. It goes back to 2002. It's called The Promise to Protect, to Pledge to Heal. So it's available for anyone to kind of review online. It's been recently revised. It's from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So it provides a format, and I don't want to speak to it specifically because I haven't really read through it all the way through, but I'm going to task myself with reviewing it now. So yeah, I just wanted to share that.
So what about the issue of spousal abuse? Obviously, there's not a mandate to report that, but another obvious abuse of power.
Well, if I could start by just broadening the concept of abuse, because usually immediately we just think of being hit. Someone's being hit physically, but I worked at the National Domestic Violence Hotline because it's headquartered here in Austin, Texas. I was there for 1.5 years. And so I was privy to what happens there, the call center. And what I learned was of all the calls, texts, and chats that come into the center, at the top of the list is emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and financial abuse, even above physical abuse. And we start to define, spiritual abuse is a type of abuse, litigation abuse. There's so many different forms. And when people are reaching out for help for spousal abuse, a lot of times it's in these different forms. And so if someone, again, doesn't have that lens to look through, they're immediately missing a big piece of knowing how to help. And at the core, it's power and control dynamics when someone has one up over somebody else. But it's tricky because, this is where this disproportionately affects women. And when there's a majority of male spiritual leaders, this is also part of what becomes challenging if women are coming for help from men and they're not understanding the situation properly, using their power appropriately if they're sending them back to another source of power and control. And so, and the biggest reason people don't talk is because they're afraid of not being believed. So the number one message I would say to faith leaders, like if someone comes to you and they're explaining abuse, they need to be believed.
I think once again, clear conversation about boundaries. I also, for 15 years, specialized in domestic violence offenders and victims. But in the mental health agency, yet in the congregation and talking with parishioners and in pastoral counseling situations, pastoral conversations that I would have with people, bringing that background that I have to the fore, just as Gina is saying, that there are all sorts of other kinds of abuse going on. When you have physical abuse, and you don't have to have physical abuse going on to have all of those other kinds of abuse that are going on that supports and even leads to the physical abuse. But being able to share with women who are in relationships that are centered on power and control rather than love and respect. Once again, that knowledge, as Gina was saying, knowledge is power. And because I have that dual background, I've been able to help women in those situations and to challenge men on their controlling behaviors. Even when, there are men who would never even think about laying hands on a woman, but have no qualms about putting a woman down in public or telling jokes about women, belittling women. We would never think about laying hands on them, but it's okay to do these kinds of things. To be able to have that knowledge and awareness and challenge that is key. And once again, it's just getting the word out there. Same thing with the sexual boundaries and sexual boundary crossings and all of those concerns.
I think what's a good resource for churches that it hasn't really, I think some churches have, but a lot of churches haven't, is a good lay counseling ministry where you're actually training the people that are appropriate in your congregation to be that lay counselor to people in the congregation to go to if they're going through some things, whether it's abusive things and in that training, you're allowing people to understand what they're capable of doing and what they need to bring to the attention of others. But they are part of the congregation, so people feel more comfortable with those lay counselors and going to them and starting that conversation, which they maybe feel like they can't with the leaders for whatever reason. So I think that's an underutilized option for some churches, is to have a good lay counseling training and then lay people for people to come to.
I think that's where, a lot of the good discussion about boundaries and knowing where your knowledge begins and ends is really important as well. Because, as I'm listening to Jeff talk, I'm thinking, if you weren't a skilled clinician, sometimes you can do damage by challenging an abuser because they can go home and make a situation, so that's where that fabulous line of the good training for the lay community, but also saying, and here's where your job ends, and making sure that everybody kind of knows those in those trainings. I think that's a great point to have those groups.
I was thinking making the gospel relevant in this area, just in terms of Gina had mentioned like emotional abuse or things like that. It's probably a way of weaving that in. It certainly is a way of weaving it in a way that is, and I think that's probably something that faith communities could do, in acknowledging it through the gospel as it's a violation of other people. It's not we weren't created for that. So so I think that might be the way to kind of address it a little bit more formally.
Excellent point, Mike. I that regardless of what the faith tradition is, whatever the Holy Scripture might be, to again connect it to that. Because I think what people struggle with often is, as one of my spiritual mentors put it, Richard Rohr, the gospel is about being nice, and nice people don't talk about things like this. But at the bottom line, it's abused and hurt so many people. So whether it's the Torah, the Quran, or the gospel, or any other sacred book or writings and readings, that connecting again with the basic value for people. So I'd like to shift this to something we've talked about some already. Question number 4, creating an atmosphere of help. Faith leaders struggling with their own sexual concerns. Ray, you made reference to the brokenness that people have who are faith leaders, their own brokenness. I know we talked about this some in June, but we wanted to come back to it. So what are some folks' thoughts about this?
I'll go ahead and start. In a lot of my work, especially in groups, and especially with the pastors groups that I run, I tend to use little Lego figurines to illustrate certain points. So if you give me permission, I like to show you what I mean by that. You may get dizzy from me moving the camera, so I'm going to stop the video just for a second. Give me like 5 seconds. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, okay. All right, so what I like to do is I like to demonstrate what happens when the pastor, let's just say that this person, this figure right here is the pastor. The reality of it is that the brokenness that we all have puts us in the same sphere, the same plane of reality. But when it comes to things as shameful and as embarrassing as sexual addiction or sexual behaviors, problematic sexual behaviors, a lot of times the pastor will distance himself from the issue and be up here looking down on the rest of the congregation and addressing this as a you guys problem, okay? And as they know that he never really addresses it, or as they are just kind of like floundering, right? They don't know what to do. And the more that he addresses it from on high, there's no way that they're going to really address it with the pastor with any sort of authenticity, because they're either worried about being shamed or they're worried about just being outed, the wrong kind of spotlight being placed upon them. And they may even associate, I have a little Jesus figure as well. They may associate that Jesus is up here with the pastor who's just so great at everything, so holy, and woe is us. Woe are we who are down here. So I challenge the pastors, and they are just some of the best people that I've ever met, and I just give them so much credit for addressing their own sexual brokenness in the group. And I asked them, what does it mean for you to not only gain sobriety and recovery for yourselves, but to spearhead this movement for your entire church? And without fail, when they really start to think about this, they say, I can't be up here. I need to be here, floundering just like them. And Jesus is walking amongst us, proud of the efforts, proud of the authenticity, proud of the addressing the commonplace brokenness that we all have, pastors included. And the pastor is spearheading the effort from a place of brokenness and saying, I too struggle with this. Let's come up with some programs that can really address this. And rather than me being up here saying, you guys, you're on your own. You're going to have to deal with this on your own because this is a sin issue and you guys have it. So I just wanted to set the table with this little demonstration to show how important it is for us to be creating this atmosphere of help. And it really is up to the leadership, I believe, that it's a top-down approach that creates an approachable culture of seeking help, because they too are seeking help.
Excellent.
Roy, thank you so much.
Thanks, Roy. Roy, it reminds me of David and Goliath as a Lutheran claymation that I remember as a kid. So I think Jeff probably remembers that as well. So
I totally remember that. Yes.
yeah. Well, I think I just speak in terms of Christian perspective, but I'm blown away by the incarnation that Christ became human, and he connects with our brokenness. And I think that's kind of, whereas we, people of different faiths, and I'm sure everyone, there's a kind of an agreement around that. That's the spot that's the opportunity to enter. After our last meeting, I actually came upon a book. I don't know the author, but it's called Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals how sexual brokenness reveals our way to healing. Jay Stringer's the author, and he kind of combines the opportunity and the brokenness, which is really, and it's kind of Christian based, so I'll give you a heads up on that. But I found it to be very helpful, and I'll probably finish it tomorrow. I'm in the waiting room, my wife.
As we talked back in June, how again do we, on the one hand, communicate or convey our own brokenness, but obviously it's not getting up in front of everyone and saying X, Y, Z. How does that live out in how a faith leader, a spiritual leader, is conducting himself or herself among his or her people within the community? To use Roy's image, how does one come down from the top among the people, no longer looking down and saying it's a them problem?
Brian, one of the things you mentioned that this is a COVID thing that was really helpful is I felt a need to connect with other Catholic men, and I developed a Catholic study group that was cross-locationally. Actually, they're mostly friends, and I have a friend who's a priest as part of it. And I think it's in these small group discussions where we can be comfortable. And this is not like a professional group. I mean, I happen to be a professional, but that's not my role in this group. It's just, I think that's where we're able to share our brokenness. It's kind of very difficult to maybe do that from the pulpit. I think that's, and quite frankly, there's probably been examples where that's been done in a very inappropriate way as well, in a very opportunistic way. But I do know that the one thing from the pulpit is we simply don't want to use the word you. It's always a we, a statement. So that's just, but I think that the humanness and be able to express that in a way that's meaningful and understandable. But I think at the same time, I have to be very careful in terms of, it's, we as religious leaders, we have our own vulnerabilities and we need to be respected as well. And maybe that's as Jeff started our conversation in terms of the appropriateness of personal boundaries, it's really important. And I guess that's determined by each of us as well.
I'll add to that. I think one of the hesitations in disclosing to people when you are a faith leader, people in your congregation, is if your livelihood depends on your role, that's super risky, right? Because if you don't know where the safety is, and if the issue is new or current, it seems like the process of getting help is going to be best had probably outside the church, and working that out, and then bringing in and sharing on that even playing field or the even level, what was gained in that process. But when something's initially being disclosed, I think that's where faith leaders need safe places. But too is there's so much shame around these issues that a lot of times it's their loved one. I mean, and I'll speak as a former wife who was concerned about her, pastor husband. And I'm like, I mean, that complicates it all the more. It's where do you go? Who do you talk to? And there came a point where I talked to the elder and elder wives because I had just gotten fed up and I wanted the light to shine in. And I used an elder wife meeting to just break the silence and tell the truth while my husband sat quietly and let me do that. So it wasn't his disclosure, it was mine. And then him and some of the elders formed an accountability group because I think honestly, they were like, oh, someone's talking about this. But how do you be honest with the people, again, that your salary is tied to? So it's a mess. All that to say, I've lived it. I've lived the complications of this. And I think it's the best bet just for churches to have outside networks and bridges. But that is a challenge in and of itself of building trust. And kind of back to what Michelle was sharing earlier, one of the things that I'm currently trying, I signed a year contract with a church in Austin to be a behavioral health consultant for them and to provide quarterly trainings. And what's happening is then they're looping me in when someone's turning to them for help and it's addiction or abuse or things that are outside their scope, because I have a network. And it's this bridge. It's saying somebody else, we need to bring in someone else that's not on staff. So I think that there's models to be created and standards to be set. And we can do it.
I agree with Gina. We can absolutely do it. And but I think it's every church's responsibility to figure out how to do that, and certainly use the models from other churches as a basis. But I'm just one person, so my pastor will come to me, and we've established together a network of other Christian counselors and people of faith that we can send people to when they're struggling. So I think that's a huge resource also.
I believe there are some men in church who have somehow have received the wisdom or the knowledge to go out on their own and seek help. And the pastor never knows about it because they're probably ashamed to come and tell pastor, hey, pastor, I battle with pornography. I've had to go to therapy for it. And I think when we can create a safe space for these men to be honest, and women to be honest about their struggle, they can also assist leadership. As Gina says, assist leadership in providing some form of healing. As Michelle said, I believe that it's very important that we don't put all the pressure on the pastor to have all the answers. There are answers right there in the pews. I mean, I didn't know that Brian and Michelle existed in the Fredericksburg area. I mean, we have these type of resources right here. They're probably sitting right there in our congregation, but because we don't talk about them, everything is so hush hush. We never know there's a jewel right there in the midst of the sand.
And I've seen that where I worship in the last year. We have kind of a support group for men. And in sharing part of my story, it turns out that there's one individual who has, I think it's a nephew, but I'm not sure, incarcerated on a child porn charge. And yet we're kind of given a message. We don't have these issues in our temple here. They don't exist. they don't exist in part because we don't allow them to be discussed. And I'm really hopeful that our new rabbi, who seems much more open to these things, will allow that kind of discussion and safety within the appropriate boundaries. So it does make a difference. And those of us who, have been on the other side do have something to offer.
Circling it back to how does a spiritual leader interact and or get support for his or her struggles with this? What Mike said a while ago is something to then focus on. Obviously, one doesn't get up and talk about it from whatever center spot there is in one's faith. In the Christian tradition, we often say pulpit. But Mike, I liked what you said about, well, then you're aware of individuals who get together and share with one another, talk with one another about these issues. In my years in the Roman Catholic Church as a cleric, that was something that we were strongly encouraged to do. The struggle always was making the time to do that. But I think the underlying issue or the underlying flow was the shame that anyone might feel, because here I am in this role, I'm not supposed to have this issue. I'm not supposed to be struggling with this. I'm supposed to be helping people with this. And again, I'm supposed to be above reproach. And again, that just feeds into the shame when one does have an issue with problematic sexual behavior, issue with one's relationship or marriage, issue with anger, issue with abuse, even in a relationship. So how do we support our spiritual leaders in recognizing that they need help with this? I know several of you are in the role of consulting on this. Maybe some thoughts about that.
I would say there's some amazing healing work that can be done in therapy around shame, because we have a lot of carried shame too. And I think we find freedom when we work through that process of taking a hard look at our shame, naming it, knowing where it rests, where it's coming from, and then going through a process of giving it back. Like a lot of times we're carrying shame that doesn't belong to us. And just because someone's in the grips of a sexual struggle or addiction, it doesn't make them often what they think that they are. And so getting to the core beliefs and mindset, getting to the truth. I mean, what more is the gospel right there? But a lot of times, I think that work a lot of times happens best in a therapeutic setting where you're working with a therapist that has tools to either, to do different kinds of therapies and help resolve these unresolved things that often go way back in a history. You have to, as you start pulling on the shame, you start pulling up your family of origin, your traumas. But this is where I love, like even what's happening in mainstream, the fact that Oprah wrote a book recently on trauma, what's happened to you. I think the more we just normalize, like it's happened to all of us, we can't escape it. Trauma, shame, struggle. And then just knowing it's okay to go call up a therapist to get help. And I think the pandemic's actually helped with that, honestly.
So Gina, I'm wondering if you were in a situation, or maybe you have been, so you were aware of a spiritual leader having a difficulty, would you encourage that spiritual leader to seek therapy?
Yes, definitely. And even to pause, like just hit the pause button, because if you don't deal with these issues, it will mount and it will get to a point where it might overtake you and you lose your ability to make some choices. So I think even pausing and being like, maybe you take some Sundays off and you don't preach, or you implement a sabbatical and you take care of you and you go, there's so many different options in the therapy world. You can do intensives. You could go deep instead of spacing it out an hour a week with a therapist. And again, how beautiful would that be if churches had that expectation even of their staff and leaders, that they take time, and maybe that's even help, if it's funded, because we need it.
Just to interject this, I'm aware of a spiritual leader who would like to do an intensive 3 days, but he said he can't afford it. So.
Yeah. Well, and you live sometimes as a faith leader, that's part, I remember my former husband talking about that. It's like a badge of honor almost when you're living in the scarcity of the fact that you don't make very much. And that's just part of what you take on. But then that creates its own issues and mindset and belief problems. People should take care of their pastors, and therapy, especially if there was an EAP program, right, for the church where you're like, we're taking care of you and your needs, and all of your needs matter. And that's learning. Self-care could be part of seminary content as well. Just, it's not selfish to take care of yourself. It's actually the opposite.
Other thoughts? Thank you.
I know in my church, we avail, I'm not on call, but I'm the counselor there. And a lot of times the church will cover the cost of people to see me for so many sessions that can't afford it or just don't have the finances or whatever. And many times when I've talked to pastors and been able to talk with them, it's a relief to them to be able to shed all of their burdens in a session or sessions. So I think that's important. I think as you say, we need to take care of our pastors, and that mental health piece is so huge, and it has many ties back to how we grew up, what mentalities and thinkings that we have that are integrated into our current way of being. And that's just important to be able to allow a pastor to go through intensive trauma therapy to get to the bottom of that. So I definitely think and know that that's important.
I want to add something too, just for faith leaders, is at least what I've seen, there is a fear that if you're going to someone that isn't a Christian, that you're going to be led astray somehow. And I remember having this mentality, like it was part of the faith cultures I was in, which is why it was indoctrinated. Like, you turn to people of faith, you turn to Christians only. And that's where your help will come from. And I did that for 15 years. And it wasn't until I finally got help outside the church that I got the help I needed, because there are specialists and expertise that exists outside the church, because they're training full time for that. Whereas faith leaders are training in a different way. And so we know this in the physical medical world. We don't think twice if we have a certain kind of cancer of going and finding the surgeon that knows how to go into that area. And if we can start to shift and decrease the fear, like getting the behavioral or mental health support from a well-trained specialist that knows how to tackle shame or knows how to tackle trauma, they're not going to mess with your spirituality. And that's my belief.
Gina, I think one of the challenges with that is sometimes faith communities are held in disdain in the mental health community, and not as respected, or, I've observed that. I think there's almost needs to be kind of like a people who are I guess faith sensitive or understand someone's religious beliefs, and I think it's very important, and I think that's something that I think a lot of religious people, and yet just the opposite too. Sometimes people from faith communities have these same judgments of mental health professionals, and so I think there's it happens both ways. So, and I guess maybe part of this is a dialogue, and having people become faith literate, so to speak, or understand what that's about, or why someone might have a belief and why that belief is important to them, and kind of respect that. And so I think but I think there's really some good opportunities as we're talking about this.
So I'm wondering if Roy or Jeff have something. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, have always been struck by the irony, as Gina was talking about guilt and shame, that it's necessary to go outside of the faith community to find good help with guilt and shame, when I'm not all that aware of other traditions, but I know in Judeo-Christian faith and practice, guilt and shame are central theological concepts and topics and bedrocks for our theology. And it amazes me that we can, as faith leaders, as people of faith, talk about guilt and shame, and without ever allowing those theological concepts to come to bear with our inner persons. And to think that a pastor or a rabbi is not equipped to help people in their congregation with issues of guilt and shame, I'm amazed. I would think that they would be the best people to go to, and that people from the so-called secular counseling world would be going to the faith leaders to say, how do I deal with guilt and shame, rather than the other way around. Another comment about the professional counselors, social workers, and faith traditions. I've seen in my 25 some years in the mental health world, this shift from when I was beginning in the mental health world, you had to be really careful about faith issues and spirituality, and that was mostly off the burner. You talk about boundaries. We're not going to talk about that in the counseling office. And a fairly general discounting of faith and spirituality, where in the last 5 years or so, I've seen a wonderful shift where before a professional, a mental health professional, would not address faith issues. Now they're seen as not providing best practices, treatment under best practices, if they don't address faith and spirituality. So I think, like you say, in many Christian circles, there's that fear that, or in that attitude and that belief, if you go to someone who is working for an agency that's not part of a Christian organization, that you're going to get a certain thing. Hopefully that's turning around, and that people will see that even if you're a Christian and you go to a counselor who's not a Christian, there still should be a basic competency there in that mental health professional to utilize that person's spiritual strengths and spiritual resources toward healing.
I'm going to agree with Jeff. I've noticed, I would say a huge percentage of the people that I see come to me because I'm a Christian, or I do Christian counseling, or I do faith-based counseling, and that's become very imperative to them. And no, we didn't used to talk about this thing, but it's becoming more and more where a lot of times I have this discussion before I even bring the person on, because they have questions about, can I discuss with you my faith-based beliefs, without seeming to be crazy. And the other thing is a research project that recently came out that's talking about this very thing. It's specifically focused on the doctrines of sin and grace, but how in the 60s, where these things weren't discussed, we're now doing a shift where a positive psychology and the doctrines, certain doctrines in the churches are seen as helpful in the clinical community. And that was, I don't know, that report was just so uplifting to me to read and see that we are making that shift and change to where we're able to minister and be with our clients if we have that ability.
Michelle, obviously, since we're colleagues, I would be interested in receiving a copy of that, and maybe all the rest of the panelists would too. So
certainly, I'm doing a journal critique on it, so that's how I came upon it. So I can, if anybody is interested, I just give it out. Sure, not a problem. Or the site to it.
So to wrap this part up, because we want to talk a little bit about how Sash, again, can best support spiritual leaders. But the bottom line, I'm wondering, would any of you, or would you counsel a spiritual leader to say in a context of an individual conversation, or maybe even with a small group, gosh, even up there in front of everyone, I go to therapy. This is my struggle with shame and guilt. What do you all think?
I think self-disclosure always needs to be well thought out before it is utilized. So I would, if I were working with a faith leader who was excited about their healing and their experience of healing, I would want to work with them to talk about, well, you want to share this with people. What are your motives, and what do you really want to accomplish? And if that's what you want to, are your motives good? Is what you want to accomplish something good? And if it is, what is the best way to utilize your experience in order to accomplish what you want to do with that?
I think though that, once those motives are processed and kind of assessed, it can be a great role model to help others. I think leaders in general, whether it's faith leaders, politicians, can do a great service by humanizing our own struggles as either faith leaders or political leaders, whatever it is. And that can be very encouraging to people to pursue whatever issues they're facing.
To what resources can Sash continue to provide to you in your role as a spiritual leader, and or in your relationships with your various communities that either you're a part of and or you serve?
So I don't know if anybody's seen like Sash's pornography poster or Sash's framework poster. I don't know who all has copies of those. I know Mike and I have copies of those at our office. I'm wondering if things like that would need to be modified to feel more appropriate in a faith, circumstance, or, if Mike's the only one that has seen it, I hate to put him on the spot. Is that something that would be perfect for folks to have sent out? I would show it to you, but I don't know that you could see it. I have one, but Mike, what do you guys think about posters that talk about when does pornography become problematic? What's a framework for problematic sexual behaviors? Would those types of things be helpful in your congregations?
Well, I think it would be, I think they're actually a pretty good resource. But before that, Mary, I'd like to say what you're doing right now is a very good resource. So I appreciate this very much. So I want to thank you for that. I think that's probably, from my perspective, this is how you kind of build it, and this is what's important. I think there's a sensitivity with different churches for sure, in terms, like you mentioned pornography. Well, pornography is like verboten. It wouldn't be like what's problematic. It is problematic, from a Catholic perspective. But but I think you're onto it. I mean, in terms of like the statistics and the problems that it, can lead to, I think, that type of education is important. I think each faith community probably has its own thoughts about some of this stuff. So I think it may be kind of, it may be a difficult task, but, I guess each faith community can have its own branding, so to speak. Maybe
I know a lot of pastors listen to podcasts. And when I think about the resources out there for pastors to be consuming information about sexual wellness and sexual brokenness, if there is something that Sash can produce on a semi-regular basis, and usually pastors have the attention span for maybe about like a 20-minute podcast episode, right? But funny enough, when it comes to Sunday football, 3 hours is not enough, for a pastor's attention span, right? But myself included. But when it comes to podcasts, something that is like really to the point, maybe like answering frequently asked questions, maybe some interviews with some other clergy who are willing to talk about their own struggles, just something that's really consumable that, and because podcasts are such a common way for pastors to get their information, they listen to it on their drive, they listen to it on their workouts, they listen to it, wherever. So, and it's easier, in my opinion, to produce than you.
It's funny that you mentioned podcasts, because as you guys were talking, I was writing down a bunch of different topics that we could do. YouTube, because we do have a YouTube channel, and the idea of self-care being not selfish, but that's how you take care of your congregation, self-disclosure, addiction 101, boundaries, how to recognize your own internal and external, and I'm hoping that maybe we can call on you guys to do, 20-minute YouTube, videos on these different topics. Because I think you're right. People might have time to listen while they're doing other things, and we get the information in that way.
I think I thought of this earlier when we were talking about congregational leadership and leadership in faith communities, that training on these issues and education is not only important for the professionals, but also for the volunteer lay leaders. That, a faith leader can try to create all sorts of change in a faith community. But if the leadership of the community doesn't buy into it or have an understanding, there's always going to be some difficulty. And especially, as Gina was describing, dealing with specific issues in the community, and like Ray was describing, dealing with specific communities, issues in the community, that there really needs to be some sort of congregational or faith community leadership training, which is really difficult because most times those positions are shifting. You have somebody who can serve as an officer in a faith community or as a president or vice president, and they may be in that position for 4 or 8 years, and then they're gone, and you have somebody new there. So there's this constant need for creating awareness in the community for that. So, like I say, not only resources for the professionals, but also for the volunteer leadership in the congregation.
Jeff, I think that's a very important issue, because I think kind of a context or an understanding when we talk about are people who are some kind of appointed and or ordained leadership role here. So I think pointing that out regarding lay folks is very, very important.
I think I mentioned this the last time we had a conversation, but I also think it's important that we go to where faith leaders are already congregating and their conferences and trainings. yeah, being thoughtful about a presentation, maybe submitting a proposal so that we can actually give them more vision for how to address these things and how to preempt the issues. So, and to be preventative. So like putting together a really thoughtful proposal, being present with a Sash table, even at a conference as a booth, I think could go a long way.
So to focus us a little bit more, our next conversation is going to be January 17th, 2022. Can you imagine? Anyway, what would you all like to see us talk about at that session, at that gathering again? First of all, and you don't have to commit yourself, but do you think you'd be likely to come? And secondly, if you did, what would you want to discuss?
I would see one issue to discuss is the ideas of inclusiveness. When there's someone in the congregation who is, say, gay or transgender or a sexual offender, how to welcome and protect and deal with the issues that come around those types of things. That would be one thought.
I think for me, and yes, Brian, I would love to participate January 17th. If I'm allowed to, yes, I would love to do that, Mary. I think for me, and maybe Gina, Mary, and Michelle could help me with this. I think that what I don't want to do is leave the sisters out. I don't want to leave our female clergy out. And that might be a struggle from some women who are clergy, that they tend to look at pornography. They might find men in the church very attractive, where they might be very aggressive with, or et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, but I believe we need to open it up, that it just doesn't appear, Roy, that just only the man or the male clergy is always the perpetrator. We want to make sure that everyone has opportunity to be able to share from different gender perspectives. At the same time, let's find ways that we can seek help, find avenues where clergy can go and really find a place to lay their head. I think we've wrestled with clergy to some extent, drinking very heavily. We wrestle with clergy, maybe even using some drugs. I know in my context, I know of some who have, and congregations have still been very receptive if it was marijuana or prescription drugs, etc. But this issue of just, sexual addiction, it seems to be horrific, and there is no forgiveness, and there is no turning back if someone falls. And we know it could be very costly for people's lives, especially when it comes to young people, and when it comes to something very severe, when someone's really been abusive and damaging. But at the same time, where does grace fall into that? I would love to kind of talk about that.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Raymond. And yeah, I was going to say something along similar lines, just that this is not a male issue. This is a humanity issue. And I'm also thinking that maybe a discussion about partner trauma. I think those in faith leadership, they may have a misconception of both sexual addiction and the effects of sexual addiction on the partner. And so they may make some rash decisions that, again, I think I don't criticize their motives, because I think they're trying to help, but because of misinformation, they may make some decisions that actually make the matters worse. And so what does a healthy response look like for both the addict or the betrayer? What does the effects of trauma look like on the partner? And sometimes sometimes in the faith communities, the pastor will quickly try to get reconciliation going, quickly get forgiveness going, and they bypass all the work that's necessary for true trust to be restored and reconciliation to be there. And that's a shame, because now the people are guilted into forgiving too quickly, and then they minimize their own experience, and then now those things leak out sideways, and it's like, what happened? So we need to I think we need to have a discussion about helping faith leaders understand the effects of sexual addiction, and the deception involved in it, and all the different traumatic effects that it has on the partner.
Great. You can count me in for future discussions. And one idea is maybe bringing some statistics about sexual activity and sexual behavior across the lifespan from our leading surveys and research nationally, but also like there's research from the faith community specifically, and bring that and show, because there's research that's really eye-opening and showing how the sexual behavior and activity doesn't seem to be that different among church people and non-church people in some ways. Also, along with that, the purity culture movement, there's been a lot of things that have come out about the damage of that, and maybe just the beliefs surrounding sexual behavior, what expectations are set. And not that there's rights or wrongs, but like we could wrestle with that a little bit of like what is actually helpful, where just expanding the lens between instead of just black and white thinking and narrow-minded thinking about it, trying to unpack it a little bit more.
Well, on behalf of the membership networking committee of Sash, we thank you so much for being here. The planning committee is very, very excited that all of you participated. Again, we really, really appreciate your time. Incredible conversation. Again,